By the heavens, what is that monstrosity?
Stop for a moment, because what you're about to hear changes everything you think you know about the flood. Not the rain, not the ark, but a silent countdown that sealed humanity's fate. 7 days. No storm, no warning signs in the sky, just time running out, and almost no one noticed. Hidden within the Great Flood account lies a chilling mystery. A forgotten gap of 7 days that determined the destiny of the entire world. Most people completely overlook this detail, yet it reshapes the meaning of divine judgment itself. There was a window brief, fragile, where humanity stood on the edge of irreversible destruction. The sacred scriptures describe a tense and agonizing week that few have truly examined. For 168 hours, the ark was already shut tight, yet the sky above remained clear and undisturbed. No thunder, no rain, only silence. What truly unfolded across the earth during those final days remains unknown. But one truth stands out: this was the final chance for the Nephilim to turn back before everything was lost. What followed was not relief, but pressure that grew heavier with every passing moment. The structure was complete. The animals were inside. And then, without human hands, the entrance was shut. Then the Lord shut him in. Genesis 7:16. No reopening, no delay, only a sealed boundary between two worlds. Noah had already received the warning. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Genesis 7:4. Yet nothing changed in the sky. Light remained. The air stayed still. That was the tension. Everything had been declared, yet nothing had begun. This pause was not emptiness. It was deliberate. A space where divine patience stretched to its limit while justice stood ready. Every hour carried weight. Every moment pressed closer to a decision already made. And outside that closed door, the world continued as if nothing had shifted, unaware that time itself had become the final warning. Outside the sealed ark, nothing slowed down. If anything, defiance intensified. The towering structure stood as a warning, yet it was met with ridicule. The world had already crossed a line it refused to acknowledge. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man. Genesis 6:4. What began as corruption had become dominion. Power had shifted. These hybrid giants shaped society, bending it away from its original design. Scripture is direct. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. Genesis 6:5. Violence was no longer an exception, it was the system. Order was replaced by distortion, and what was created good had been fundamentally altered. Yet Noah kept building, not in secret, but in full view. A visible message, day after day, a structure rising against disbelief, and alongside it, a warning repeated until it lost all impact, ignored, dismissed, forgotten. Still, the declaration stood. I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land. Genesis 6-7. Then, without warning, everything began to shift. Without force, without command from Noah, the animals began to arrive. 2 and 2 went into the ark to Noah, as God had commanded Noah. Genesis 7-9. Predators and prey moved side by side. No chaos, no resistance, just quiet obedience to something higher. That was the moment everything should have become clear, and yet, instead of understanding, the world moved one step closer to collapse. When the wild responds, when creation itself aligns, when order returns without human control, what excuse remains? And still, the world watched and chose not to understand. And just when everything seemed ready, sealed ark, gathered creatures, a world fully warned the final delay was set in place. Not another year, not another generation, only 7 days. Why would judgment pause when the decision had already been declared? The answer is buried in a life that stretched longer than any other. Thus, all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. Genesis 5:27. His death was not random. It marked a boundary, a signal. His name, often understood to mean when he dies, it shall be sent, carried a weight that only became clear at the very end. Ancient tradition holds that his passing came just before the flood began, and those final days became a period of mourning. A pause not of weakness but of intention, even as corruption had filled the earth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. Genesis 6:11. Time was still extended. 7 days, not empty, not silent without meaning. A final space where everything could have turned. Because this is the part many miss. The delay was not for the righteous, it was for everyone else. The door was already closed, the outcome already decided. Yet the world was given one last stretch of time to respond, to recognize, to step away from what had consumed it. Nothing new was required, only a change of direction. But nothing changed. The same voices, the same certainty, the same refusal to see what was unfolding in front of them. Even with the clearest boundary in place, the world remained exactly as it was. And that is what makes these 7 days so unsettling. Judgment did not begin immediately, because mercy had not yet fully withdrawn. And still, nothing shifted in the hearts outside. The influence that had reshaped the world ran too deep. What should have been a moment of realization became defiance instead. Strength was trusted. Power was unquestioned. The very idea of judgment was dismissed as impossible. Yet the record had already declared, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever." Genesis 6:3. A limit had been set, and it was approaching fast. Inside the ark, there was no uncertainty about that limit. Noah and his family were separated from everything familiar, enclosed within walls that now stood between preservation and collapse. Outside, the voices didn't stop, the same laughter, the same challenges. Where is the promise? 2 Peter 3-4. The same refusal to accept what had already been warned. But something was changing, not in the sky, but in the weight of everything beneath it. The air itself seemed different, still, pressed, as if creation was holding back something it could no longer contain. Because this was not just a delay, it was the final approach. Scripture gives a deeper layer to what was unfolding. God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into chains of gloomy darkness. 2 Peter 2-4. What had once acted freely now stood under sentence. And even if unseen, that reality was closing in. The reaction outside began to shift. What started as mockery hardened into agitation. What had been dismissed now stood immovable, a sealed structure, untouched, unreachable. The animals were inside. The door would not open, and the realization began to surface, too late to change direction. Pressure builds when denial can no longer hold. Every passing moment tightened that pressure. The world continued to move, but something irreversible had already been set in motion. The boundary was fixed, the decision was sealed, and no force outside that ark could alter what had already been determined. The line had already been drawn, and it was not drawn by man. Then the Lord shut him in. Genesis 7:16. With that single act, access ended, not gradually, not partially, completely. What remained outside would stay outside. This was more than a closed entrance. It was a separation no human strength could reverse. He shuts, and none can open. Job 12:14. The ark was no longer an invitation, it was a boundary. Inside, preservation. Outside, a world still moving, still speaking, still convinced nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, everything had already changed. The days continued to pass, and with each one, the tension sharpened. What had been dismissed as impossible now stood immovable. The sealed door did not respond, the structure did not yield, and the realization, slow at first, began to spread. This was no longer a warning, it was the aftermath of a decision already made. Scripture describes the condition that led to this moment. The earth was filled with violence. Genesis 6:11. That condition had not reversed, not even now. Even with the clearest line in place, nothing outside turned back. No movement toward the ark, no shift in direction. And then came the silence. Not absence, but wait. the kind that presses without sound. No storm yet, no visible sign, only a stillness that carried more certainty than thunder ever could. Because when nothing changes after the door is closed, it reveals something deeper. There was never going to be a response. Inside, Noah remained where he had been placed, holding to what had already been spoken. Outside, the same voices continued, questions, challenges, certainty without evidence. Where is the promise? 2 Peter 3-4. The same pattern, unchanged. But the purpose of those days was unmistakable. This was the final clarity before consequence. A demonstration that judgment does not arrive without warning. It arrives after it has been ignored fully, repeatedly, and completely. And now, even with the boundary visible, even with time still moving, the world chose to remain exactly as it was. Then the seventh day reached its limit, and the stillness shattered. Not from above, but from beneath. All the fountains of the great deep burst forth. Genesis 7:11. The earth itself gave way. What had been held back was suddenly released. The ground split open with force beyond control. Water surged upward from hidden depths, tearing through the very foundations people trusted. The same ground that had carried cities, power, and certainty now turned unstable, collapsing under the weight of what had been ignored. And only after that did the sky respond, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Genesis 7:11. Above and below aligned at once. There was no direction left to run. In that moment, everything became clear. What had been warned was now undeniable. What had been dismissed now stood in full view. The realization came fast, but it came too late. Movement shifted instantly. The same people who once stood at a distance now rushed toward the ark, toward the only place that had been prepared. But the boundary remained. The door did not move. It had already been set. No force, no urgency, no realization could reverse it. The time that had been given had already passed. And so the world faced what it had refused to consider without delay, without interruption. They moved toward higher ground, trusting elevation, strength, and endurance. But none of it held. What was unfolding was not a localized event, it was total. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth. Genesis 7:18. There was no stable ground left to claim. The surge came from every direction. From below, from above pressure without relief. What once seemed unshakable began to disappear beneath it. All the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. Genesis 7:19. Height no longer offered safety. Distance no longer mattered. The Nephilim resisted, but resistance had no effect here. The very force they relied on could not match what had been released. The waters prevailed above the mountains. Genesis 7:20. At that point, the outcome was no longer uncertain. It was unfolding exactly as declared. And then the record is clear. All flesh died that moved on the earth. Genesis 7:21. No exception, no surviving structure, no remaining system. What had dominated the world could not endure what had come against it. The same creation that had been altered was now being reset. What had risen in defiance was brought to its end not gradually, but completely. Those 7 days revealed something precise, not just patience, but a boundary. Time was extended, warnings were clear, yet the outcome did not change. Because patience, no matter how great, is never without an end. The account leaves no ambiguity. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. Genesis 6-5. That condition remained until the very last moment. And when the boundary was reached, the transition was immediate. Inside the ark, there was separation, preservation, secured not by strength, but by response to what had been spoken. Outside, everything else followed a different course. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground. Genesis 7:23. Not partial, not selective, complete. What had defined the world, its systems, its structures, its confidence did not carry forward. What stands out is not only the destruction, but the division. The 7 days were the threshold. On one side, a world that continued unchanged despite every warning. On the other, a new beginning that had not yet appeared but was already secured. And that is the core of it. The difference was never the event itself. It was the response before it happened. What makes those final days so striking is how far mercy was extended right to the edge. The opportunity did not vanish early. It remained until the very last moment. Yet, the outcome shows a hard reality. Extension does not guarantee response. Scripture frames it clearly. God's patience waited in the days of Noah. 1 Peter 3:20. Time was given, space was allowed, but the condition of the world did not shift. What had taken hold remained unchanged, even as the boundary approached. And as the boundary closed in, the contrast became undeniable. Noah did not act because he saw evidence. He acted because he trusted what had been spoken. By faith, Noah constructed an ark for the saving of his household. Hebrews 11:7. While everything around him appeared stable, his response was already aligned with what was coming. That is the difference that carried forward. Because when the rain finally began, the rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Genesis 7:12. It was not the beginning of the decision. It was the confirmation of one already made. And that is the overlooked truth. The turning point was never the storm. It was the silence before it. Most accounts rush past the silence and focus on the storm, but that silence carried the real turning point. While nothing seemed to happen, everything was being decided. Not on the surface, but at a level deeper than sight. Scripture hints at a dimension often overlooked, the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey. In the days of Noah, 1 Peter 3:19-20, what had moved freely before was no longer beyond reach. The same period that looked empty to human eyes marked a decisive shift in the unseen order. And while the waters rose, the separation became absolute. The ark did not struggle, it lifted, not by force, but by design. The higher the waters climbed, the further it moved from everything below. What remained outside followed a different end, exactly as declared. The record continues. The world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. 2 Peter 3-6, not weakened, ended. What had defined that age did not carry forward into the next. Systems, power, influence, none of it crossed that boundary. What followed did not fade, it carved a lasting imprint across every generation that came after. The flood became more than an event, it became a reference point. A demonstration that intervention is not theoretical. It happens, and when it does, it redraws everything. The closed door stands as the clearest marker. Separation is real, and once set, it does not shift. And this is where the pattern begins to extend beyond that moment. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming. Matthew 24-37. The comparison is not about water, it is about response. Awareness versus indifference. Recognition versus dismissal. Because the same structure appears again. Warning given, time extended, silence maintained. And then, a moment when everything changes at once. The detail that often goes unnoticed, the 7 days, proves something critical. What looks like delay is not delay at all. It is the final alignment before action. When the 7 days reached their end, the window that had remained open was no longer available. It did not close slowly, it was already sealed. What followed simply revealed what had been fixed from the moment. Then the Lord shut him in. Genesis 7:16. One family remained inside, everything else stayed outside. Scripture makes the outcome unmistakable. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. Genesis 7:23. That is the line the 7 days established. Not just survival, but separation. What had defined the world before did not cross into what came after. And at this point, the meaning deepens even further. Throughout Scripture, the number 7 marks completion, a full cycle, a finished work. And on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done. Genesis 2-2. The same pattern appears again not in creation, but in conclusion. The final week did not introduce judgment, it completed it. That silence, then, was not empty, it was final. Because once completion is reached, nothing is added, nothing is adjusted. The same generation that dismissed every warning remained unchanged until the very end. And when the waters rose, they revealed what had already been decided. There is also something else often overlooked. No further negotiation appears in the record. The condition had already been described. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6-5. That state did not reverse. And because it did not reverse, the outcome did not either. So the 7 days stand as more than a delay. They mark the exact boundary where patience ends and completion begins. Noah stands apart for one reason, not perfection, but response. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, Genesis 6-8. And that favor was expressed through action when nothing around him supported it. By faith, Noah constructed an ark, Hebrews 11-7. No visible sign, no changing sky, only a word and a decision to trust it. This is exactly what those 7 days were meant to expose. Faith does not wait for confirmation, it moves before it. While everything outside remained stable, Noah remained aligned with what had already been declared. And when the shift finally came, it came without warning. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. Genesis 7:11. No build-up, no gradual transition. Imagine that moment, the ark lifting, the boundary holding, the realization settling in. What had been trusted in silence was now undeniable. But with that confirmation came a second reality. What was preserved inside could not extend to what remained outside. Because the flood did more than change the surface, it divided history itself. The end of all flesh has come before me, Genesis 6:13. A before and an after. And the bridge between them was not the rain, it was the silence that came first. That is the warning carried forward. What seems like stillness is often the final space given before everything shifts. And once it does, the direction is no longer chosen. That silence did not end. It continues to echo forward across time, not as noise, but as a pattern. A warning that does not force attention, yet remains unmistakable to those who recognize it. Because what happened then was not random, it revealed how decisions are made before events unfold. Methuselah's death marked the final signal, but the 7 days that followed carried the real weight. A complete span where nothing outward changed, yet everything inward was being settled. Scripture reminds us that delay is not absence. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, but is patient toward you. 2 Peter 3-9. What appears still is often intentional. That week defined more than a moment, it defined direction. Each response, or lack of it, became fixed. Noah's testimony was not only in what he built, but in how he remained steady when nothing confirmed it. The structure stood, the door was closed, and the silence remained unbroken until it wasn't. And that same pattern is not confined to the past. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming. Matthew 24-37. Not the same events, but the same conditions. Distraction, confidence. A world continuing without interruption, unaware that the decisive line is already near. This is where the weight increases. Because the difference was never knowledge, it was response. The warnings were visible, the time was given, yet the majority remained unchanged. And when the shift came, it came all at once. For they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. Matthew 24-39. No transition, no second phase. What stands now is the same principle. The moment of change does not announce itself in advance. It confirms what has already been chosen. The account leaves one enduring image: a closed door that did not reopen, and a preserved remnant that did not need to force it. Separation, once established, remained. And beyond that, separation came renewal. I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Genesis 9:11. The rainbow that followed was not the beginning. It was the sign that everything prior had been completed. But even that sign points backward to the storm, and before the storm, to the silence. That is where everything turned. So the question is not whether such moments exist, it is whether they are recognized while they are still quiet. If this changed the way you see these events, follow now, because there are more hidden details like this that most people never notice. Because once they pass, they are no longer moments to respond to, but moments that define what comes next.